Well, folks, we're moving quickly here, aren't we? In previous modules, we got a taste of how macroeconomists thinks about what drives the short-run macro equilibrium. We learned about how shocks can ripple through the economy. We used the Keynesian cross to understand that. And then we learned about how spending, output, and interest rates and money all came together in the ISLM model. And we use that ISLM model to examine stabilization policies, how certain shocks can be neutralized with the explicit goal of making sure that the economy was running neither too hot nor too cold. And we put special attention on the case of an extreme recession like the one that occurred just back in 2008 and 2009. In that case, most economists, many at least, believe that things would have been much worse, much worse, if the Federal Reserve had not stepped in with a monetary increase and the government had not sharply raised expenditures and cut taxes. Well, is it time to catch our breath and stop? No, not really. We've got some more work to do. You may notice that we've left something out of the picture, the general price level. That's right, folks. In previous modules, we did talk about the growth of overall price levels. That's what we call inflation. We acknowledged that something that you yourself already know, that inflation is a barometer of the cost of living. If inflation goes up, unless your wages or your salary also go up by the same amount, you suffer. You have less real income, less real buying power. That's just one reason of several why people worry about inflation. So why haven't we talked about inflation in the past couple of modules? Well, on the one hand, we wanted to keep things simple for you. It's quite enough to be keeping track of output, expenditures, and interest rates and money, I'm sure, without also worrying about prices. And in fact, economists often do this. They assume that something else can be fixed, in this case, prices. Not because they don't think that it's an issue, and prices are always going to be an issue for economists, but it's just because we need to focus on other stuff for right now, but just for now. So the inflation issue, the issue of inflation, has been waiting in the wings, but no longer front and center. It's time for inflation in the short run to take center stage. Now, in a previous module, we told you about what we call the classical model, where we use the quantity theory or the equation of change. You remember, MV is equal to PQ, to help us understand why, in the long run, money and prices will move together one-to-one with no change in anything else in that equation. So velocity, remember, that's determined by technology, institutions. Output, Q, is determined by our productive function, our productive capabilities, our total factor productivity, labor, capital. And I just parenthetically here, we really are building on stuff that we've learned in previous modules. It should be all kind of building up. So what was left now is that if in this previous theory of inflation, this long-run theory, was that if we had an increase in the money supply of, let's say, 10%, that meant in the long run an increases of prices of 10% and no change in either V or Q, because those variables just aren't affected by monetary policy. Well, that's still true in the long run. That's got to be our anchor, that idea, the quantity theory, the point of reference. We have to keep it in mind, folks, but it is a long run anchor. But in the short run, we're going to find that short-run factors can move the price level and the output level at the same time. So we're going to find, for example, if we have an increase in demand, something that pulls GDP above its full employment or its natural level, that is going to be putting some strains on the economy, and those strains will be reflected in the price level. So think of it like this. As firms struggle to meet higher demand, let's say if you have an upward spending shock, their costs are going to rise. And they may have to coax out some new workers, come on, off the couch or out of school or something like that. All of this is going to mean higher costs for firms. They may have to coax these extra workers now with maybe higher wages. So folks, these are higher costs that these firms are facing, and the firms are going to be passing at least some of these costs in the short run, maybe gradually over time, but they're going to be passing them on to their customers in the form of higher prices. That's one form of inflation. We call that demand pull inflation. Well, we'll be learning about demand pull inflation and also cost push inflation when things go bad on the supply side, for example. Prices go up, but output goes down. Think of what happens to food prices in a severe drought, for example. The supply of food goes down, but their prices go up, and this is very important in some countries. This is the part where I get to tell you about the tools that we'll be using to analyze inflation and output in the short run. The short run aggregate supply curve, for example, and the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is named after an economist who was also an engineer from New Zealand, A.W. Phillips. And we'll be learning how we go from the short run, where money can have an impact on output, to the long run, that other world that we described, that we use the quantity equation. Now, it turns out that there's a policy component to this module also, okay? So as you may know, it's one big job of the central bank, most countries, including the United States, the Federal Reserve, to keep inflation in check. Not too high, not too low. Now, that's not the only job of the Fed, but most would agree that that's probably its main job. So we're going to be looking, or I should say you will be looking, at the monetary policy challenges of the Fed. We'll be looking at an inflation report, and we'll be asking you to analyze the challenges facing the Fed. What should it do? What do you think it will do in the next meeting regarding monetary policy? That's right. You'll essentially be trying to outguess the Fed. And let me tell you something. If you're successful at that and you get good at that, there might be some money in it for you, you know? But anyway, now you may be asking something here. We're talking about monetary policy. The Fed does monetary policy. So you may be asking, does the Fed actually use the LM curve in its analysis? Okay, we just learned it. Do they actually use something like that? And the answer is not exactly. Not exactly. Modern central banks more often discuss and phrase their monetary policies in terms of interest rates. Okay, so you may hear, is the Fed going to raise interest rates? Raising interest rates mean a monetary contraction, for example, a reduction of the money supply, while lower interest rates can mean a monetary expansion, an increase in the money supply. Well, it turns out that yes, we will be summarizing the interest rate policy of a central bank in a nice curve or line graphically that looks like the LM, but there's some differences. Okay, now they're not big differences. We don't think that you're going to have any problem absorbing those differences. In fact, I think you'll find that the monetary policy interest rate function that we introduce is a close cousin of the LM, and you'll see it's a nice, easy analytical tool. So, 3 tools here. Short-run aggregate supply and Phillips curve to tell us about inflation, and then this interest rate function that's a cousin, an analytical cousin to the LM curve that's going to tell us about monetary policy, what the Fed might do. So let's get going.